There are some things in this universe that should never exist. Creatures that defy the natural order so completely that their very existence becomes a question that gnaws at the foundation of what we understand about biology, psychology, and the cruel machinery of fate itself. I am one of those things. My name, the one they gave me, is Marcus. But names are fragile constructs, aren't they? Labels we place on beings to make sense of them, to categorize them, to pretend we understand what lurks beneath the surface. And what lurks beneath my surface is something that no human name could ever truly capture. I am an orc, but I was raised by humans. And in that simple statement lies a paradox so profound, so fundamentally wrong, that to understand it is to peer into an abyss where nature and nurture collide with the force of a planetary impact. This is my story, though I wonder sometimes if calling it a story gives it too much dignity. Perhaps it's better described as a warning or a testimony to the universe's capacity for creating monsters that don't quite fit any of the categories we've carved out for them. Before I can make you understand what it means to be me, before I can paint the picture of a childhood spent trying to be something I could never be, I need you to understand what an orc truly is. Not the crude caricatures you see in Imperial propaganda, not the simple-minded brutes that feature in soldiers' campfire stories. I need you to understand the biology, the psychology, the fundamental wrongness that is encoded into every cell of greenskin existence. Only then can you begin to comprehend the horror of trying to suppress that nature, to cage it within the confines of human morality and civilization. So let me take you into the depths of what makes an orc an orc. Let me show you the war that raged inside my body every single day of my existence. And then, perhaps, you'll understand why my story could only ever end one way. The biology of violence. To understand what I am, you must first abandon everything you think you know about reproduction, about growth, about the relationship between mind and body. Humans are born from flesh, nurtured in wombs, entering the world as helpless creatures that require years of care to survive. Orcs? We are something else entirely. We are the fusion of animal and fungus, a symbiotic nightmare engineered by ancient beings whose names have been lost to time, but whose legacy of violence echoes across the galaxy. Every orc carries within them the potential for an entire ecosystem. We don't reproduce through conventional means. Throughout our lives, we release spores, constantly, invisibly, each one carrying the genetic blueprint not just for more orcs, but for the entire orcoid species complex. Those spores drift on air currents, settle into soil, burrow deep beneath the surface of whatever world has the misfortune to host orcoid life. And there, in the darkness, they grow. First come the fungi, spreading their networks through the earth, preparing the ground. Then the squigs emerge, those bizarre limbless beasts that serve as livestock and weapons and pets all at once. After them, the snotlings appear, small and simple-minded, existing primarily to tend the fungal gardens and maintain the basic infrastructure of orcoid life. Then come the Gretchen, the grots, more intelligent than snotlings, but still subservient, still part of the machinery that supports the real apex of orcoid evolution. And finally, the orcs themselves burst forth from the ground, already larger than a human child, already possessing knowledge they should not have. This is what makes us so terrifying to exterminate. You can kill every orc on a planet, burn their settlements to ash, reduce their armies to corpses and char. But the spores remain, hidden in caves, buried in soil, scattered across continents by winds and water. And in 10 years, or 20 or 50, the greenskins will rise again. A world touched by orcs is never truly free of them. We are a plague that cannot be cured, only managed. But the spores are just the beginning of our biological horror. The real nightmare lies in our physical construction. Human bodies are complex, fragile things, filled with specialized organs that can fail in countless ways. Hearts can stop, lungs can collapse, livers can fail, kidneys can shut down. The human body is a symphony of vulnerability, and orcs, we are something brutally, efficiently simple. Our bones are thick as ceramite plating, reinforced not with marrow, but with a spongy fungal matter that makes them nearly unbreakable. Our skin is tough as cured leather, green from the chlorophyll that courses through our blood, allowing us to photosynthesize energy directly from sunlight. We don't need the complex digestive systems that humans require. Our bodies are filled with what the Margot's biologist calls fungal soup, a substance that somehow performs the functions of liver, kidneys, spleen, and pancreas all at once. We have gills scattered across our bodies for oxygen absorption. We have redundant systems for everything. I have seen humans die from wounds that I would shrug off. A severed arm? Inconvenient. But an orc pain boy can staple it back on, and will be fighting again within hours. A gut wound that spills intestines onto the ground. Messy, but survivable. We feel pain, yes, but it's distant, muffled, more informational than agonizing. Our bodies are designed for one purpose: survival in combat. And they excel at that purpose with a ruthless efficiency that makes human resilience look like tissue paper in comparison. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of orcoid physiology is how we grow. Humans reach a certain size and stop, limited by genetics and nutrition. Orcs, we never stop growing, ever. And the mechanism that controls our growth is something that should not exist in any sane universe. We grow through combat, through victory, through respect. An orc that fights and wins becomes bigger, stronger, more muscular. The more battles we survive, the more victories we accumulate, the larger we become. It's not gradual, like human aging, it's noticeable. An orc can go into a particularly brutal fight as a regular boy and emerge days later, visibly larger, his muscles thicker, his bones denser, his skin tougher. And this growth feeds on itself. Because as we get bigger, we become more dominant. And as we become more dominant, other orcs respect us more. And that respect, channeled through the psychic gestalt field that all orcs generate, actually causes us to grow even more. The war bosses, the great leaders who command entire crusades of greenskins, can grow to 10 feet tall or larger. Some historical records speak of war bosses who rivaled imperial knights in size, towering monsters whose very presence could dominate a battlefield. The beast, according to legend, grew large enough that his shadow could darken entire city blocks. All because he won, because he fought, because he embodied the fundamental principle of orcoid existence. Might makes right. This is what I am, biologically. A creature engineered for war, designed by ancient beings to be the ultimate survivor, the perfect soldier. Every cell in my body carries instructions for violence, for growth through combat, for an existence defined entirely by the pursuit of conflict. This is what flows through my veins, what's encoded in my DNA, what whispers to me from the deepest parts of my brain, where consciousness meets instinct. Now imagine trying to raise something like that as a human child. Imagine trying to teach it peace, cooperation, civilization. Imagine the war that would rage inside that creature's mind and body every single day as billions of years of genetic programming screamed one thing while human culture demanded another. That was my life. That is my curse. The awakening mind. But the biology is only half the horror. Because orcs aren't just physically different from humans. Our minds work in ways that should be impossible, ways that violate every principle of how consciousness is supposed to develop. Human children are born knowing almost nothing. They must learn language, learn to walk, learn basic concepts like object permanence and cause and effect. Everything must be taught, programmed into their blank slate brains through years of patient instruction and experience. This is why humans are so adaptable, so variable in their behaviors and beliefs? Because they are shaped almost entirely by their environment. Orcs are born knowing things. We emerge from our fungal wombs, already understanding language, already possessing the basic knowledge needed to survive in orcoid society. An orc boy knows how to speak, how to fight, how to recognize hierarchy, how to maintain basic weapons and equipment. This knowledge isn't learned. It's genetic. Somehow, impossibly, the ancient beings who created us managed to encode information directly into our biology. Knowledge written into the very structure of our cells, waiting to activate as we mature. But it gets stranger. Some orcs, called odd boys, are born with specialized knowledge that goes far beyond the basics. The mech boys emerge from the ground understanding engineering, mechanics, physics. They can look at a pile of scrap and instinctively know how to assemble it into a functioning vehicle or weapon, even though they've never been taught these skills, never studied these principles. The knowledge is just there, bubbling up from somewhere deep in their genetic code. Pain boys, the orc surgeons, possess an innate understanding of orcoid anatomy and physiology. They know which squirty tube connects to which wriggly bit, as they say, without ever cracking open a medical text or attending a single class. This knowledge is instinctive, genetic, impossible. Weird boys manifest psychic powers, channeling the Gestalt psychic field that all orcs generate into devastating attacks. Rundhards instinctively understand how to manage Gretchen and Snotlings, how to organize the slave castes that support orc society. All of this knowledge, all of these capabilities, exist independent of learning or experience. They are simply part of what it means to be an orc. The Magos biologist theorizes that this is the legacy of the Brain Boys, the legendary beings that orcs speak of in their limited mythology. More likely, these Brain Boys were the Old Ones, ancient Xenos of immense power who waged war against the Necrons and their Catan masters in a conflict so vast it scarred the galaxy itself. The Old Ones were masters of biological engineering, creating entire species as weapons in their cosmic war. And the Orcs, or rather our ancestors the Krork, were among their greatest creations. The Old Ones needed soldiers who could survive anything, who could rebuild their numbers after catastrophic losses, who could wage war across countless worlds without the need for complex supply lines or extensive training. So they engineered knowledge directly into the Krork genome, creating beings who were born understanding how to fight, how to build, how to maintain the technology necessary for interstellar warfare. They created living weapons that came with their own instruction manuals written into their DNA. But they built in something else too, something that perhaps they didn't fully intend, or maybe they did, and the implications were too terrible to contemplate. They built in a need for violence so fundamental that it transcends mere preference. Orcs don't just enjoy fighting. We need it. The way humans need food and water, orcs need combat. An orc deprived of fighting begins to weaken, not just psychologically but physically. The muscles atrophy, the body shrinks, the vibrant green skin turns pallid and sick. We become lethargic, depressed, literally wasting away. Violence isn't a choice for us. It's a biological necessity, as essential to our survival as breathing. And the psychology that supports this need is something human minds struggle to even comprehend. Orcs have no concept of love, at least not as humans understand it. We don't form pair bonds. We don't experience romantic attraction. We don't nurture our young because we have no young to nurture. We emerge from the ground fully formed, already capable of violence, already understanding our place in the hierarchy. The closest thing we have to affection is respect for bigger, stronger orcs. And even that is more instinctive recognition of dominance than any genuine emotional bond. We don't experience empathy in any conventional sense. The suffering of others, even other orcs, doesn't move us unless it affects our status or our access to violence. We'll abandon wounded comrades without a second thought if there's better fighting elsewhere. We'll betray allies if it means joining a stronger boss. Loyalty in Orc society is entirely pragmatic, based on who's biggest and who provides the best opportunities for violence. And we don't understand fear the way other species do. Oh, we can feel fear. An Orc facing an obviously superior opponent will sometimes flee rather than die pointlessly. But it's not the deep existential fear that paralyzes humans. It's more tactical calculation than genuine terror. And we never fear death itself. Never. Because death in combat is the most natural thing in the universe to an Orc. It's expected, even welcomed, as long as it comes during a good scrap. The human concept of building for the future, of creating things that will outlast us, of working toward long-term goals that we personally will never see accomplished. This is utterly alien to the Orc mind. We live in an eternal present, focused entirely on the now, on the current fight, the current challenge, the current opportunity for violence. An Orc doesn't wonder about his legacy or worry about what will happen after he's gone. Those are concerns for beings that fear mortality, and we do not. What drives us, what fills the space where human emotions would be, is something purer and more terrible. The joy of combat, the thrill of violence, the satisfaction of crushing an enemy beneath our fists, of hearing their screams, of watching them break and knowing that we are bigger, stronger, better. This isn't cruelty in any human sense because cruelty requires understanding that you're causing suffering and choosing to do it anyway. For Orcs, violence isn't a choice or a moral failing. It's existence itself. We fight, therefore we are. And underlying all of this, supporting and amplifying it, is the Gestalt psychic field. All Orcs generate a subtle psychic energy, and when we gather in groups, that energy combines, creates feedback loops, strengthens us in ways that defy physical laws. This field is what allows our ramshackle technology to function, what makes weapons work that by all rights shouldn't, what causes paint color to actually affect performance because enough Orcs believe it does. If we think red ones go faster, they go faster. If we think more Dakar is always better, then somehow the guns actually do fire more effectively when we add more barrels. But the field does something else too. It creates a kind of collective consciousness, a way for Orcs to instinctively recognize who's in charge, who's biggest, who deserves respect. We can feel each other's presence, sense the strength of nearby Orcs, know without being told where we stand in the hierarchy. And as the field grows stronger with numbers, as more and more Orcs gather together, something happens. The violence intensifies. The need for combat becomes overwhelming. Intelligence actually increases, as if the collective psychic presence of thousands of Orcs elevates each individual beyond what they could be alone. This is the crucible that births the Great Crusades, the massive invasions that the Imperium calls by the Orc name for them. When enough greenskins gather in one place, when the psychic field reaches critical mass, the pressure becomes unbearable. Every Orc feels it, a pull toward violence so strong it might as well be gravity. They gather around the biggest, strongest war boss they can find, and they erupt across the galaxy like a green tide, overwhelming everything in their path, through sheer numbers and limitless aggression. These crusades are a mix of holy war, migration, pub brawl, and genocide. They sweep away entire civilizations, destroy armies that have stood for millennia, reduce proud warrior cultures to ash and memory. And the Orcs do it all with what can only be described as joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at finally getting to fight to their full potential, to test themselves against worthy foes, to experience violence on a scale that satisfies the screaming need that defines their existence. And when the crusade ends, when every enemy has been killed or has fled beyond reach, when there's nothing left to fight but each other, the Orcs turn on themselves with the same enthusiasm. Brothers who fought side by side for years will suddenly be trying to kill each other, and they see nothing wrong with this. It's natural, it's expected, it's what Orcs do. The strongest survive, claim dominance, maybe start another crusade. The weak die, their spores settling into the soil to begin the cycle anew. There is no tragedy in this for them. There is no sense of loss. There is only the eternal, glorious fight. This is what I was born to be. This is what every cell in my body, every genetic instruction written into my DNA, every instinct hardwired into my brain demanded that I become. A creature of pure violence, finding joy in combat, growing stronger through conflict, living only to fight and fighting only to live. A being for whom peace is death and war is the only true existence. Now imagine being that creature and being raised by humans who desperately wanted you to be something else. Imagine the screaming dissonance between what you are and what they need you to be. Imagine spending every moment of every day fighting a war inside yourself that you can never truly win because the enemy is your own nature. That was my childhood, and it was worse than you can possibly imagine. The impossible discovery. The settlement was called Redemption's Edge, which should tell you everything you need to know about the kind of people who lived there. It was one of those frontier colonies that the Imperium spawns by the thousands, worlds at the very edge of explored space, where desperate or devout humans try to carve civilization out of wilderness. They'd chosen a harsh planet, all red rocks and thin atmosphere. The kind of place that punishes weakness and kills the unprepared. The kind of place where only the truly faithful or truly desperate would choose to live. What they didn't know, what the initial surveys had somehow missed, was that their chosen world had been touched by orcs some 70 years prior. A minor raiding party, maybe 100 greenskins, had landed to loot what they thought was an abandoned Imperial outpost. They'd found it more heavily defended than expected, and the entire orc force had been wiped out by automated defense systems that were still functional. Every orc killed, every body incinerated. A complete victory by any reasonable measure. But orcs don't do complete defeats, because even in death, we spread spores, and those spores had drifted on the winds, settled into crevices and caves, waited patiently for the right conditions. 70 years they waited, dormant, patient in a way living orcs never are. And then came the colonists, terraforming the world, enriching the soil, creating exactly the environment those spores needed to germinate. The colonists began finding signs about 3 years after landing, fungi growing in strange places, odd footprints in the wilderness, livestock disappearing. They didn't understand what they were seeing, not at first. The records of the previous orc incursion had been classified, buried in Imperial archives they had no access to. They thought they were dealing with some native species, maybe a predator that had survived the terraforming, or perhaps something mutated by exposure to the atmosphere processes. They organized hunting parties, set traps, posted guards. All the sensible precautions you'd take against wildlife. And they started finding the Gretchen, those small, clever creatures that humanity often mistakes for the only threat. They killed the grots they found, burned the bodies as a precaution against disease, congratulated themselves on solving the problem. They had no idea that the Gretchen were just the beginning. That deeper in the wilderness, in caves and canyons far from the settlement, the real orcs were emerging. Young ones, youths as we call them, barely a year old in terms of active life, but already larger than adult humans. Feral orcs, with no older greenskins to guide them, operating on pure instinct. They were fighting among themselves, establishing dominance hierarchies, slowly working toward the critical mass that would birth a crusade. It was only a matter of time before the settlement was discovered. And then, it would have been a massacre. A couple hundred human colonists against even a dozen orcs. It wouldn't even be a fight. It would be butchery. The orcs would have killed everyone, burned the settlement, and used the resources to build crude spacecraft for raiding other worlds. Standard orc behavior, playing out exactly as it had 10 million times before across the galaxy's blood-soaked history. But fate, or the Emperor, or just sheer random chance, intervened in the form of a surveyor named Thomas Brennan. He was mapping the northern Badlands, solo work that took him far from the settlement for days at a time. He was good at it, meticulous, careful. The kind of person who checked and double-checked his equipment, who planned for contingencies, who didn't take unnecessary risks, which makes what happened next all the more improbable. His vehicle hit a sinkhole, some underground cavity that the mapping survey had missed. The transport dropped 3 meters before the auto-stabilizers caught it, slamming Thomas against his harness hard enough to crack ribs. Dazed, in pain, he managed to extract himself from the damaged vehicle and assess the situation. The sinkhole had opened into what looked like a cave system, and from deep in that darkness, he could hear sounds, movement, rustling, something alive down there. His first thought was that he'd found the source of the livestock disappearances. His second thought, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering down from above, was that he'd found something much worse, because there, in the shadows, he could see green skin. A massive shape, larger than any human had a right to be, moving in the darkness. Thomas Brennan was many things, but a warrior he was not. He'd never seen combat, never fired a weapon except at paper targets during mandatory colonial defense training. His knowledge of Xenos threats came entirely from educational vids and cautionary tales told by veterans. But he was smart and curious, and blessed or cursed with the kind of courage that comes from not fully understanding how much danger you're in. He should have run, should have radioed for help immediately, gathered every armed colonist, and returned with overwhelming force. That's what the Imperial Guard manuals would recommend. That's what any sensible person would do. But Thomas Brennan wasn't operating on sense. He was operating on that peculiar mix of scientific curiosity and frontier stubbornness that makes humans colonize death worlds in the first place. He approached the cave, carefully, weapon drawn, though what good a civilian slug thrower would do against an orc, he couldn't have said. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and he saw something that stopped him cold. Because the massive shape in the shadows wasn't moving toward him. It wasn't charging or roaring or displaying any of the aggressive behavior he'd been taught to expect from Xenos threats. It was curled up in a corner of the cave, and it wasn't alone. There were bodies around it, orc bodies, judging by the green skin and massive frames, 5 or 6 of them, dead for hours or maybe days, already starting to decompose in that peculiar way orc corpses do. The fungal components of their biology breaking down and releasing more spores. And in the middle of all that death, surrounded by the corpses of its kin, was the shape Thomas had seen. An orc, no question about that. But small. Much smaller than the dead ones. Perhaps chest-high to Thomas himself, which made it tiny by greenskin standards. The creature was injured, deep gashes across its torso, one arm hanging at an odd angle, green blood matting its skin. It looked up as Thomas's light found it, and their eyes met. And in that moment, Thomas saw something he would never have thought possible in an orc. He saw fear, real, genuine, desperate fear, the look of a child who knows it's about to die. Later, Thomas would try to explain what happened next. He'd say that he was in shock from the crash, not thinking clearly. He'd say that the creature was clearly just a juvenile, not a real threat. He'd say that his ribs were hurting, and he was pumped full of adrenaline and he wasn't making rational decisions, all of which was probably true. But I think the real reason, the one he could never quite articulate, was simpler than that. He saw a child in pain. And some part of him, the part that had moved to a frontier world because he believed in the Imperium's mission to bring civilization to the stars, couldn't just walk away and let that child die. Even if the child happened to be a Xenos, even if saving it violated every protocol and regulation and common sense guideline in existence, even if it might doom them all. Thomas Brennan climbed down into that cave, approached that injured orc juvenile, and instead of putting a bullet in its brain like any sane person would, he treated its wounds. He splinted the broken arm with pieces of his equipment. He used his medical kit, designed for humans but adaptable enough for orc physiology in a pinch, to seal the worst of the gashes. He gave it water from his canteen. and when the juvenile orc, delirious from pain and blood loss, passed out, he carefully, impossibly, lifted it into his damaged vehicle and drove back to the settlement, with his unconscious Xenos passenger hidden under a tarp. What possessed him to hide me, rather than turn me over to the settlement's authorities, I'll never fully understand. Maybe he knew they'd kill me immediately. Maybe he thought I could provide intelligence about the orc threat. Maybe he was just so far into his bad decision that he figured he might as well see it through. Whatever his reasoning, Thomas Brennan smuggled an orc juvenile into a human settlement and hid it in his personal quarters. And that's how I became the only orc in the galaxy raised by humans. Not through some grand experiment or deliberate choice, but through the improbable intersection of a sinkhole, a surveyor's curiosity, and the kind of blind compassion that defies all reason. It shouldn't have been possible. By every law of biology and behavior, it should have ended in disaster within days. But somehow, impossibly, it didn't. I survived those first critical days. I healed. I woke up in a human home, surrounded by human faces, speaking human language. And the war inside me, the war between what I was born to be and what they desperately needed me to become, began in earnest. A war that would rage for years. A war that I was always, inevitably, destined to lose. The early years. Memory is a strange thing when you're caught between two natures. My earliest clear memories are fragmentary, disconnected, more impression than coherent narrative. I remember pain, both physical and deeper, more existential. The ache of healing bones, yes, but also the ache of wrongness, of being in a place that made no sense to instincts I didn't yet understand I possessed. Thomas kept me hidden for the first few months. His quarters were on the edge of the settlement, a small prefab structure designed for single occupancy, perfect isolation for a secret that could get him executed for xenophilia if discovered. He'd come home from his surveying work to find me awake, alert, watching him with what he later described as unnerving intelligence for something so young. I learned later that orc juveniles are born with more cognitive capability than human infants, our brains already wired with language centers and basic reasoning skills. I wasn't a baby. I was more like a feral child, possessing intelligence but lacking context, understanding structure but not content. He started teaching me Gothic, the Imperium's common tongue. This was easier than it should have been. The orc brain is designed to absorb language rapidly, part of our genetic programming. Within weeks, I was speaking in simple sentences. Within months, I was nearly fluent, though my accent must have been atrocious, my voice box not quite designed for human phonemes. I'd growl and snarl my words, turn sibilants into something harsh and guttural. But it was recognizably Gothic. And Thomas seemed amazed by the progress. But language was the easy part. What Thomas struggled with, what he couldn't quite make sense of, was everything else about me. I didn't sleep like humans do, not really. I'd go dormant for a few hours, my metabolism slowing, but I never achieved the deep unconsciousness that humans need. I was always somewhat aware, always ready to snap to full alertness at the first sign of threat. This made Thomas nervous, I think, the way I could go from apparently asleep to fully alert in a heartbeat. It wasn't natural. It wasn't safe. My diet was another challenge. Thomas tried to feed me standard ration packs, the processed food that sustained the colonists. I could eat it, technically. My orc physiology could extract nutrients from almost anything organic, but it wasn't satisfying in any real way. What I craved, what my body demanded, was meat. Raw meat, ideally, still bloody and fresh. The fungal gardens that should have been cultivated by Gretchen and snotlings to feed me were absent, forcing my body to rely more heavily on photosynthesis and conventional eating. I spent hours in the sun, my green skin soaking up light, converting it to energy, with an efficiency that photovoltaic cells would envy. But the strangest part, the aspect of my existence that I think disturbed Thomas most, was my growth. Even deprived of combat, even kept passive and hidden, I was growing. Not as fast as I would have been in Orc society. Not developing with the explosive speed that victory and violence would have brought. But growing nonetheless. When Thomas first smuggled me into his quarters, I was perhaps 4 feet tall. Within 6 months, I'd gained another 6 inches. My muscles were developing, filling out, my bones thickening. The orcoid genetic programming was inexorable, turning me into something larger and stronger regardless of circumstance. Thomas realized that he couldn't hide me forever. Eventually, someone would notice the extra food consumption, or hear me moving around in his quarters, or simply discover me through bad luck. He needed help. And more than that, he needed someone who could help him answer the question that haunted his every waking moment. What was he supposed to do with me? He confided in Margaret Brennan, his wife. This conversation, he told me years later, was one of the hardest of his life. How do you explain to your spouse that you've been hiding a Xenos in your home, that you've been committing what amounts to treason against the Imperium, that you've risked everything for a creature that by all rights should have been killed the moment it was discovered? Margaret should have been furious, should have reported him immediately, should have insisted on killing me to end the insanity before it doomed them both. But Margaret Brennan was cut from the same improbable cloth as her husband. She was a teacher, someone who dedicated her life to educating the settlement's children, to shaping young minds, to believing that intelligence and compassion could overcome circumstances of birth. And when she first saw me, cowering in the corner of Thomas's quarters, speaking broken Gothic and looking at her with eyes that held far too much understanding for something that should have been a mindless killer, she didn't see a monster. She saw a student. It's easy to romanticize what happened next, to imagine some touching scene of instant connection and mutual understanding. The reality was messier, more complicated. Margaret was afraid of me, at least at first. I was alien in every sense, my green skin and tusks and massive frame setting off every danger. Instinct evolution had programmed into human brains. And I was afraid of her, my orc instinct screaming that she was weak, that I could kill her easily, that I should assert dominance or flee, or do anything except stand there passively while she examined me like a specimen in a laboratory. But we both pushed through that fear. Margaret, because she was constitutionally incapable of giving up on a student, no matter how unconventional. And me, because some part of my developing mind recognized that these humans represented something I'd never experienced in that cave surrounded by corpses. They represented safety, care, the possibility of existence without constant violence and competition. The Brennans made a decision that would define the rest of my life. They wouldn't kill me. They wouldn't turn me over to the authorities. They would try to raise me, to educate me, to see if an orc, given human upbringing and human values, could become something other than the monster its genetics demanded. It was an experiment with a sample size of 1, conducted by amateurs, with no controls and no real understanding of what they were attempting. It violated every principle of xenobiology and common sense, and it should have failed catastrophically from day one. But somehow, impossibly, it worked. At least for a while. Margaret began teaching me in earnest. Not just language, but math, science, history, philosophy. Everything she taught to the human children of the settlement, she taught to me. And I absorbed it with a speed that astonished her. The orc brain, designed to acquire knowledge rapidly, turned out to be surprisingly well suited for formal education. I learned to read within weeks. I understood mathematical concepts that took human children months to grasp. I could memorize entire passages of text after a single reading. But there were gaps. Profound, disturbing gaps in my comprehension of human concepts. When Margaret tried to teach me about empathy, about understanding how others feel, I could grasp it intellectually but not emotionally. I could simulate the correct responses, say the words that indicated compassion, but there was something missing. Some fundamental connection between understanding another's pain and caring about it simply didn't exist in my neurological architecture. Morality was even harder. The human concept of good and evil, of actions being wrong independent of their consequences, made no sense to my orc-wired brain. I understood that humans valued these concepts. I understood that following human moral codes was necessary to survive in human society, but understanding and believing are different things. Deep down, where instinct lives, the only morality that made sense to me was strength. The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. Everything else was just elaborate justification for refusing to admit this fundamental truth. And then there was the violence. Oh, the violence. It called to me every single day, not as a thought or desire, but as a need so fundamental it might as well have been hunger or thirst. I would watch Margaret teach, see her move her hands as she explained some concept, and part of my brain would be calculating how easily I could snap those arms. I would sit in Thomas's quarters, listening to him describe his day, and some dark part of me would be imagining crushing his skull between my hands. Not because I hated them, not because I wanted to hurt them specifically, but because violence was my native language, the only form of interaction that felt truly natural and right. I never acted on these impulses. I learned to suppress them, to cage them behind layers of learned behavior and genuine gratitude for the Brennan's care. But the impulses were always there, always waiting, like predators crouched in the shadows of my mind. And they were growing stronger, because I was growing stronger. And an orc that grows strong needs to fight. It's not optional. It's biology. The Brennans tried to channel this need into acceptable outlets. Thomas took me on his surveying trips, letting me carry equipment, use my strength for productive purposes. The physical labor helped, gave me something to do with muscles that demanded activity. But it wasn't enough. Moving rocks and hauling gear, no matter how heavy, couldn't satisfy the deep craving for real exertion, for pushing my body to its limits, for testing myself against actual resistance. Margaret tried to introduce me to competitive sports, the games that human children played, but they had to be adapted heavily. I was too strong, too fast, too dangerous to play with human children. A casual shove from me could break bones. A collision during a running game could kill. So I played alone, or with weighted equipment that simulated opposition, or not at all. The isolation was crushing, though I lacked the emotional vocabulary to express it at the time. I was the only one of my kind for hundreds of miles. No other orcs, no greenskin society to belong to, no gestalt psychic field to connect to. I was fundamentally, absolutely alone, in a way that humans struggle to comprehend. You grow up surrounded by your own species, seeing faces like yours, hearing your language, understanding that you belong to something larger. I had none of that. I was one, singular, isolated. But I also couldn't truly belong to human society. The Brennans kept my existence secret for as long as possible, but eventually others in the settlement discovered me. The reactions ranged from fear to revulsion to clinical fascination. Some colonists wanted me killed immediately. Others saw me as a useful resource, something that could be studied or utilized. None of them saw me as a person. I was a thing, a xenos, an other. The settlement's leaders were pragmatic about it in the end. Killing me would serve no purpose beyond assuaging fear, and the Brennans were respected members of the community. As long as I remained contained, posed no threat, I could be tolerated. But I would never be accepted, never be trusted, never be anything but a dangerous pet kept on a very short leash. So I lived in a strange limbo, not fully orc, my development stunted by lack of combat and isolation from others of my kind. Not human, my biology and instincts forever separating me from the species trying to civilize me. I learned to read and write. I learned mathematics and science. I learned to speak eloquently, to simulate human emotional responses, to present a facade of civilized behavior that almost convinced everyone, including sometimes myself, that I could be more than my genetics. But underneath it all, the real me was waiting. The orc that I was always meant to be, that my every cell demanded I become, that existed independent of all the human learning and values and desperate attempts at redemption. And as I grew older, As my body continued its inexorable development toward full orcoid maturity, that buried nature grew harder and harder to contain. The war inside me was escalating, and everyone involved, the Brennans and the settlement's leaders, and even me in my more honest moments, knew that sooner or later something would have to give. You can't cage a sun, you can't teach a storm to be gentle, and you can't raise an orc to be human, no matter how much you want to believe otherwise. But they tried. For years they tried. And in that trying, they gave me something I should never have had. They gave me a choice, a possibility, a chance to be something other than what I was born to be. And that gift, that impossible, wonderful, terrible gift, made everything that came after so much worse. Because now I knew what I was giving up. Now I understood what I was destroying. And that understanding, that uniquely human burden of self-awareness and regret, was perhaps the cruelest thing they could have given me. The growing divide. By the time I reached what the Brennans estimated was equivalent to human adolescence, I stood nearly 7 feet tall and weighed close to 400 pounds. My frame was massive, shoulders broader than any human's, arms thick with muscle that seemed to grow denser every week. My skin had deepened from the pale green of a juvenile to a darker, richer shade, like copper oxidized by weather. Tusks jutted from my lower jaw, impossible to hide, making my appearance unmistakably inhuman, even from a distance. The settlement had reluctantly adapted to my presence. I had a designated area on the absolute outskirts, a reinforced shelter that could contain me if necessary. I was allowed to work on labor crews, moving heavy equipment and materials that would have required multiple humans and machinery. The colonists maintained a careful distance, never quite meeting my eyes, speaking to me in the clipped tones one might use with a dangerous animal that's temporarily docile. Margaret continued my education, though it grew more difficult as my size increased. We couldn't use standard classroom spaces anymore. Too easy for me to accidentally damage furniture designed for humans. Too disturbing for the other students to have something my size looming in their peripheral vision. So she tutored me privately, in open spaces where my bulk felt less threatening, under the red sky of that frontier world. She taught me literature, and I absorbed it with an enthusiasm that surprised us both. Poetry, prose. The stories humans tell themselves about who they are and what they value. I read them all, understood them intellectually, could analyze themes and symbolism with a sophistication that would have earned praise in any imperial scholar. But something was missing. The emotional resonance that these works held for humans, the way they could move someone to tears or inspiration or despair. I could recognize it in others, but I couldn't feel it myself. When Margaret read me passages about love, about characters sacrificing themselves for others out of affection and connection, I could see how it affected her. Her voice would soften, her eyes would brighten or dim, depending on the scene. She felt these things. They meant something to her on a level that transcended intellectual appreciation. For me, they were just words, beautiful words, cleverly arranged, but ultimately no more moving than a mathematical proof. I could admire the construction without experiencing the content. The same with morality tales, with stories of heroism and redemption, with all the narratives humans use to teach values to their young. I understood what was being communicated. I grasped that humans valued self-sacrifice, courage in service of others, compassion for the weak. I could recite these values perfectly, but they remained external to me, costumes I could put on, but never truly wear. Because underneath, my orc nature operated on different principles entirely. My biology was becoming a more serious problem as I matured. The photosynthesis that supplemented my diet grew more efficient, yes, but also more demanding. I needed to spend hours in direct sunlight, my skin soaking up radiation and converting it to energy. On cloudy days, I felt sluggish, irritable, as if part of my internal power had been dimmed, and no amount of photosynthesis could fully replace proper orcoid nutrition. I needed meat, lots of it, raw, ideally, though I learned to tolerate cooking for the comfort of human observers. The settlement's protein reclamation couldn't keep up with my consumption. I ate portions that would have fed a family for days. And still I was hungry, my body craving nutrients it wasn't getting, demanding resources to fuel growth that wouldn't stop. Thomas arranged for me to hunt in the wilderness, which helped, but even that wasn't really solving the underlying problem, because what my body truly needed, what it was designed to consume, was the orcoid ecosystem. Squigs and fungi cultivated by snotlings and Gretchen, the whole biological support system that evolved alongside my species. Deprived of that, my body was trying to compensate, but imperfectly, leaving me in a state of constant low-level nutritional stress. It manifested as irritability, as restlessness, as a gnawing dissatisfaction that no amount of eating could truly assuage. And then there was the strength. Even trying to be careful, I broke things constantly. Furniture not designed for my weight. Tools sized for human hands. I learned to move delicately, to calculate the force needed for every action, to exist in a state of constant restraint. It was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Every moment of every day, I had to remember that I was dangerous, that a casual gesture could injure, that my natural strength had to be carefully modulated to avoid disaster. Human spaces felt like dollhouses, doorways too small for my shoulders, requiring me to turn sideways and duck, ceilings too low, making me hunch constantly to avoid hitting my head, chairs that would collapse under my weight. The entire physical world of the settlement was designed for creatures half my size and a fraction of my mass. I was too large for their civilization, literally unable to fit into the spaces they'd built. But the physical challenges were manageable compared to the psychological ones. Because as I matured, as my brain developed, I began to understand what I was missing. The genetic knowledge that should have been activating, the instinctive understanding that should have been bubbling up from my DNA. It was there, but contextless, purposeless. I had the knowledge of how to maintain and operate orc weapons and vehicles, but no weapons or vehicles to use that knowledge on. I understood orc hierarchy and social dynamics, but I was alone, the only greenskin for 100 miles. It was like having a language in your head that no one else speaks, like knowing how to play an instrument that doesn't exist. The knowledge was useless, worse than useless, because it reminded me constantly of what I wasn't, what I could never be in this human settlement. An orc needs other orcs. We're not solitary creatures despite our aggression. We're pack hunters, social beings, designed to exist in groups where our individual strengths combine into something larger. Isolated, I was incomplete. A gear separated from the machine it was meant to drive. And that incompleteness manifested as a deep, aching wrongness that I had no words to describe. The humans saw my growing restlessness, my increasing difficulty sitting still, my tendency to pace and prowl when I should have been resting. They interpreted it as typical adolescent energy. They had no idea it was something far deeper, far worse. The violence cravings intensified. They moved from background noise to constant pressure, a drumbeat in my head that never stopped. I began having dreams, though whether they were truly dreams or genetic memories activating I couldn't say. Images of combat, other orcs, massive and scarred, locked in brutal struggles for dominance. The feeling of fists impacting flesh, of bones breaking, of victory. I would wake from these dreams with my hearts racing, my muscles tensed, ready for fights that weren't happening. Thomas tried to help by increasing my physical labor, giving me harder tasks, heavier loads. But labor isn't combat. Moving rocks doesn't satisfy the same need as fighting for survival. It's like trying to satisfy sexual hunger with calorie consumption. The mechanics are superficially similar, but the actual needs are completely different. I needed to fight, to test myself, to pit my strength against resistance that fought back. I began provoking confrontations, without quite meaning to, testing boundaries, pushing against rules to see if anyone would stop me. The settlement's enforcers gave me wide berth, unwilling to confront something they knew they couldn't actually control through force. This made everything worse, because it confirmed what my instincts had been telling me all along. I was stronger than them. I could dominate them. Their authority over me was fictional, maintained only through my consent. And as I became more aware of this dynamic, my willingness to maintain that consent eroded. Why should I obey rules set by creatures weaker than myself? The only answer was the abstract one Margaret had taught me. Because civilized beings constrain their power for the collective good. But that answer required believing in civilization as a value in itself, and I couldn't quite manage that belief. Not when every cell in my body was screaming, "That might makes right." The Brennans watched my deterioration with increasing alarm. I was becoming sullen, withdrawn, prone to outbursts of irritation over small frustrations. They increased my counseling sessions, trying to talk through what I was experiencing. But how could I explain that I needed to hurt something? That the only thing that would truly satisfy me was combat, real combat with actual stakes? You can't explain that to people whose entire worldview is built on the premise that violence is a last resort, that thinking beings should solve problems through dialogue and reason. I tried to be what they wanted. I genuinely did. I valued the Brennans, appreciated what they'd done for me, recognized on some level that they'd given me opportunities no orc should have. But appreciation isn't the same as belonging. Gratitude isn't the same as fulfillment. And I was hollow inside, a hole in the center of my being that grew larger every day, shaped exactly like the orcoid existence I'd been denied. The Gestalt psychic field that should have connected me to others of my kind was absent. I generated it, I think, my brain producing the same psychic energy that all orcs create. But with no other greenskins to connect to, it just dissipated, unused, like shouting into a void and hearing no echo. The loneliness of it was crushing, though I lacked the framework to understand what I was feeling as loneliness. I just knew that something was missing, something fundamental, something I needed the way humans need air. Margaret tried to address this through virtual connection, introducing me to literature and vid records of other worlds, other cultures, as if knowing that other beings existed somewhere in the galaxy could substitute for actual connection with them. It couldn't. Reading about families didn't give you a family. Learning about communities didn't make you part of one. I remained fundamentally, existentially alone. The settlement children my age avoided me completely now. When I was smaller, less obviously dangerous, some of them had been curious, even friendly in a cautious way. But as I grew larger, as my physical power became undeniable, fear replaced curiosity. They would cross streets to avoid walking near me. Parents would usher them inside when I appeared. I was the monster in the settlement, the dangerous thing that lived on the edge, tolerated but never welcomed. I began spending more time in the wilderness, away from the settlement and its constant reminder of my otherness. The red rocks and thin atmosphere suited me better than the close quarters of human habitation. Out there, alone, I could move freely without worrying about breaking things or scaring people. I could run at full speed, test my strength against boulders and dead trees, exist without the constant need for restraint. It was during one of these wilderness excursions that I found the cave system, miles from the settlement, hidden behind rockfalls and scrub vegetation, a network of caverns extended deep into the planet's crust. Something about them felt familiar in a way I couldn't articulate. The darkness, the enclosed spaces, the sense of being in a place where violence had occurred. Later I would realize that these were the caves where I'd been found, where my orc kin had killed each other in dominance struggles before discovering me, the smallest and weakest, and deciding I wasn't even worth the effort to kill. I began returning to the caves regularly, drawn by something I didn't understand. I would sit in the darkness, my orc biology allowing me to see with minimal light, and try to remember what had happened there. But the memories were fragmentary, unreliable, more sensation than narrative. Pain, fear, the smell of blood and fungal decay, the sound of bodies hitting stone, and underneath it all, a feeling that this was right, that this was where I belonged, in the darkness and violence, where orcs were meant to live. The Brennans noticed my increasing absences, my growing preference for solitude. They interpreted it as depression, another human framework imposed on orcoid experience. Margaret insisted I meet with the settlement's counselor, a kindly older man who tried to apply human psychological principles to a brain that didn't operate on human principles. The sessions were useless, sometimes actively harmful, forcing me to examine feelings I didn't have and mourn losses I couldn't articulate. What I needed, what my entire being cried out for, was other orcs. A proper greenskin society where I could fight and compete and find my place in the hierarchy. Where my size would be respected, my strength valued, my nature understood and accepted rather than feared and suppressed. Where violence wasn't a moral failing, but the fundamental currency of existence. Where I could be what I was without apology or shame or constant self-monitoring. But that world was denied to me. The choice, if it could be called that, had been made years ago when Thomas pulled me from that cave. I would be raised human, educated human, taught human values and expectations and ways of being. And if that meant warring with my own biology every day, suppressing instincts so fundamental they might as well be reflexes, living in a constant state of hunger for something I could never have, well, that was the price of civilization, the cost of being saved. Except I had never asked to be saved, never consented to this experiment. I was an orc, however much the Brennans wanted to deny it, however much they tried to educate the greenskin out of me. And orcs aren't meant to be alone. We're not meant to be civilized. We're not meant to suppress our nature for the comfort of other species. We're weapons that walked, killers that talked, violence given form and consciousness. And you can dress a weapon in philosophy and poetry and human values. You can teach it math and science and proper table manners. You can tell it that it's more than its design, that it can choose to be gentle, that violence is a choice rather than a destiny. You can believe all of that, truly believe it with every fiber of your being. But in the end, a weapon is still a weapon, and sooner or later, it will be used for what it was made for. The Brennans didn't understand this. They thought nurture could overcome nature, that environment could triumph over genetics, that enough love and education and patient guidance could reshape something at a fundamental level. They were wrong. Not because they didn't try hard enough or because they weren't sincere in their efforts. They were wrong because you cannot educate away billions of years of evolutionary engineering. You cannot love away genetic programming. You cannot teach a creature to be other than what it was designed to be. I was an orc, and orcs exist to fight, and I was being starved of the one thing my species needs to survive. The war inside me wasn't going to end through meditation or counseling or philosophical discussion. It was going to end the way all orc conflicts end, in violence, in blood, in the fundamental assertion of nature over nurture, instinct over learning, truth over wishful thinking. I just didn't know when or how or who would suffer when I finally, inevitably, broke. The genetic awakening. The change began subtly, with dreams that felt more like memories. I would close my eyes and see images that made no sense from any experience I'd actually had. Massive machines, crude but effective, built from scrap and held together by faith and bolts. Weapons I'd never touched, but somehow knew how to maintain, how to upgrade, how to modify for maximum killing potential. Battlefields I'd never walked, soaked in blood and littered with bodies, beautiful in their chaos. These weren't fantasies. They were something deeper, more intrusive. Genetic memories activating as my brain matured, ancient knowledge encoded into my DNA by beings long dead, information bubbling up from the depths of my cells like oil seeping through rock. The mech boy knowledge was trying to manifest, that peculiar orcoid ability to understand technology instinctively, to look at a pile of junk and see the weapon it could become. I found myself drawn to mechanical things with an intensity that surprised even me. The settlement's equipment, the vehicles and generators and fabrication tools. I could see their inefficiencies now. could spot the ways they could be improved, modified, made more powerful, or faster, or more destructive. My hands itched to take them apart, to rebuild them according to patterns I was only beginning to understand, to make them orky in ways that would terrify the humans who relied on them. Margaret noticed the change in my focus. She encouraged it, actually, thinking it was a healthy development, a constructive outlet for my energy, a skill that could make me useful to the settlement. She arranged for me to work with the maintenance crews, to learn human engineering principles in a formal setting. She thought she was giving me a career path, a way to integrate more fully into colonial society. She had no idea she was watering seeds that should have been left to wither. Because the more I learned about human technology, the more clearly I understood how wrong it was. Not wrong in the sense of broken or inefficient, though it was both of those things. Wrong in the sense of fundamentally misunderstanding what machines are for. Humans built machines to be safe, reliable, predictable. They wanted tools that did the same thing the same way every time, that required minimal maintenance, that would last for generations with proper care. Orc technology wasn't like that. Orc technology was alive in a way human machines never would be. Built from scrap and intuition and the Gestalt psychic field that all greenskins generated, our machines worked because we believed they would work. A human looking at an orc weapon would see impossibility, contradictions in design, components that shouldn't function together but somehow did. They would call it crude, ramshackle, held together by luck and ignorance. They would be wrong. Orc technology was elegant in its own way, efficient in ways that human engineering couldn't replicate. We didn't need complex supply chains or specialized components or careful calibration. We needed scrap and belief, and the willingness to accept that sometimes guns exploded and killed their users. But that was fine, because a weapon that might kill you was still better than no weapon at all. We built for now, for the current fight, for immediate devastating power, rather than long-term reliability. And I could feel that knowledge in me, growing stronger, demanding expression. The urge to build, to create, to make things that went fast and hit hard and looked proper orky. It wasn't a choice. It was compulsion, genetic programming asserting itself with the same inevitability as puberty or aging. The mech boy was waking up inside me, and all my human education couldn't suppress it. I started small, modifications to my own equipment that the maintenance supervisors probably wouldn't notice. A power cell rewired for greater output at the cost of lifespan. A servo motor stripped of safety limiters to run faster and hotter. Hand tools ground down and rebuilt into shapes that fit my massive hands better, that could apply force in ways human tools weren't designed for. Little things, subtle things, but each one felt right in a way that following proper Imperial engineering protocols never had. The more I built, the more the knowledge flowed. It was like opening a door in my mind that had always been there but locked. And now it was swinging wide, letting in light and understanding and capability I'd never known I possessed. I understood force dynamics and stress points and how to make things robust through simplicity rather than complexity. I could look at a machine and see not what it was, but what it could be, potential crying out for realization. The settlement's vehicles became my obsession. They were slow, careful things, designed for safe transport across rough terrain. I wanted to make them fast. I began experimenting during maintenance shifts, when I was supposed to be performing routine checks, removing weight, adjusting fuel ratios, modifying suspension systems for performance rather than comfort. The changes were minor enough that the vehicles still functioned within acceptable parameters, but I could feel them becoming more alive, more responsive, more orky. And then one day I went too far. I'd been working on a cargo hauler, one of the big machines used to transport materials from mining sites to the settlement. It was absurdly slow, governed to a safe speed that made sense for human drivers but felt like torture to me. I disabled the governor, upgraded the engine, modified the transmission. When I was done, That hauler could move twice as fast as before, could accelerate with startling aggression, could turn corners at speeds that would have terrified a human driver. I tested it after hours, when no one was watching. Took it out into the Badlands and let it run, really run, pushing the modified engine until it screamed with power and speed. And for the first time in years, I felt something approaching satisfaction. The machine was doing what it was meant to do, going fast, pushing limits, being more than its creators had intended. It felt orky, it felt right. But I'd been sloppy, too excited by my success to properly hide the modifications. The next morning, when the regular driver took the hauler out for a normal run, he discovered what I'd done. The vehicle's new speed terrified him, the aggressive acceleration nearly causing him to crash. He brought it back immediately, reported the unauthorized modifications, demanded to know who'd tampered with critical safety systems. The investigation didn't take long. I was the only one working maintenance who had the size and strength to perform some of the modifications. And when they examined the changes more closely, they saw my handprints all over them. Not literally, though my massive hands had left marks on components, but figuratively. The style of the work, the priorities it revealed, the complete disregard for safety in favor of performance. It was obviously not human engineering. The settlement's leadership convened to discuss what to do about me. I wasn't present for the meeting, but Thomas told me later what was said. Some wanted me expelled from the settlement, sent into the wilderness to fend for myself. Others suggested more extreme measures, permanent solutions to the Xenos problem in their midst. The Brennans argued passionately in my defense, pointing to my education, my years of peaceful coexistence, my value as a laborer. But the fear was palpable. I had demonstrated that I possessed abilities that went beyond simple brute strength. I could modify their technology, make changes they didn't understand, potentially sabotage critical systems if I chose to. The compromise was restriction. I would no longer be allowed to work on anything mechanical or technological. My labor would be limited to simple physical tasks that required no specialized knowledge. I would be monitored more closely, my movements restricted, my access to tools and equipment carefully controlled. I was being downgraded from a valued member of the workforce to a dangerous pet that needed stricter confinement. Margaret tried to soften the blow by explaining that it was for everyone's safety, including mine. That the settlement couldn't risk having someone making unauthorized modifications to critical systems. That I needed to understand boundaries and respect them. But I could see in her eyes that something had changed. She was afraid of me now, not just of my physical size, but of what I represented. The orc inside me was becoming visible, undeniable, impossible to educate away. The restrictions chafed like chains, being reduced to simple physical labor, being denied the opportunity to build and modify and express the mech boy knowledge that was demanding outlet, felt like suffocation. I endured it for weeks, months, trying to be cooperative, trying to prove I could still be trusted. But the resentment grew. The sense of injustice, that I was being punished for expressing abilities that were fundamental to my nature, that I was being caged for becoming what I was always meant to be. And underneath the resentment, feeding it, amplifying it, was the growing hunger for violence. The mech boy urges had been a distraction, an outlet that channeled some of my orcoid nature into productive creation. Denied that outlet, all my genetic programming had left was its original purpose. Fighting. I needed to fight. The need had progressed from background pressure to active pain, a constant ache in my muscles and bones and brain that nothing could ease. I began having violent fantasies, increasingly elaborate scenarios of combat and bloodshed. I would imagine fighting the settlement's enforcers, breaking their weapons and their bodies with my bare hands. I would envision battling wild animals in the Badlands, testing my strength against predators and crushing them. Most disturbingly, I began fantasizing about fighting other orcs, massive battles where I could prove myself against opponents who matched my size and strength. These fantasies were different from the genetic memories. Those had been impersonal, distant, knowledge without emotional content. The fantasies were immediate, visceral, accompanied by a savage joy that terrified me. Because I wasn't just imagining violence. I was looking forward to it, craving it. The thought of finally fighting, really fighting, filled me with an anticipation so intense it bordered on ecstasy. I started testing myself, seeing how much I could lift, how fast I could move, how much damage my fists could do to inanimate objects. I would go into the wilderness and find boulders to punch, trees to tear apart, testing my power against the world. And with each test, I grew slightly larger, slightly stronger. The orcoid growth mechanism was activating even without combat, triggered by the simple act of exertion and the anticipation of future violence. The Brennans could see the changes in me, the increased muscle mass, the darkening of my skin, the way my eyes had developed that particular gleam that humans recognized as predatory, dangerous, wrong. They increased the counseling sessions again, brought in a confessor from the local chapel to speak to me about controlling base impulses, about the virtue of restraint, about how all thinking beings must master their savage natures. The confessor was a tall, stern man who spoke of the Emperor's grace and the importance of rising above the bestial. He assured me that I could transcend my Xenos nature through faith and discipline, that every creature had the capacity for redemption if they truly sought it. He was so confident, so certain in his righteousness, so absolutely convinced that words and prayers could overcome genetic imperatives millions of years in the making. I listened politely, nodded at appropriate moments, said the words he wanted to hear about striving for better, about fighting my nature, about choosing the higher path. And all the while, part of my mind was calculating how easily I could kill him. How few seconds it would take to cross the space between us, to wrap my hands around his throat, to crush his windpipe, and silence his sanctimonious lecture forever. I didn't, of course. The consequences would have been immediate and final. But the fact that I was thinking it, that I could imagine it in such vivid detail, that part of me wanted to do it just to prove that all his faith and philosophy meant nothing against raw physical power. That should have been a warning sign. Should have told everyone, including me, that the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone wanted to admit. The genetic awakening had consequences beyond just the mech boy knowledge and violent urges. I was becoming more resistant to human authority, less willing to accept restrictions on my behavior, increasingly resentful of being treated as lesser when I was obviously stronger. The orcoid social instincts were manifesting, the deep programming that said bigger orcs dominated smaller ones, that might made right, that the weak existed to serve the strong. Every human I interacted with was smaller than me now, weaker, more fragile, and my orc brain, increasingly dominant over the veneer of human education, couldn't understand why I should obey them, why I should accept their rules, their restrictions, their authority. They couldn't enforce any of it through force. If I chose to rebel, chose to assert myself, they had no way to stop me short of killing me. And that understanding was corrosive, eating away at whatever remained of my willingness to cooperate. Margaret tried one last time to reach me, to connect with the students she'd spent years educating. She took me aside, away from the settlement, to a place where we could talk without observers. And she asked me directly, what did I want? What would make this bearable? What could she do to help me? I wanted to tell her the truth, that I wanted to fight, that I needed violence the way she needed air, that every moment of peaceful existence was agony, a denial of my fundamental nature, a slow death by suppression, that the only things that would help were the things she could never give me. Other orcs to fight, proper orcoid society to belong to, the freedom to be the violent, aggressive, magnificent creature I was born to be. But I couldn't say any of that, because saying it would mean admitting that everything she'd worked for, every lesson she'd taught, every hour of patient instruction had failed. That you couldn't educate an orc into being human. That nature did triumph over nurture. That I was, after all, just a monster she'd been foolish enough to try and civilize. So I lied, told her I just needed time, that I was going through a difficult phase, that I would learn to manage these urges. Promised her I would try harder to fit in, to respect the restrictions, to be the student she wanted me to be. And she wanted to believe me so desperately that she did, despite all the evidence suggesting otherwise. We both knew I was lying, and we both pretended we didn't know. Because the alternative was admitting that this experiment, this attempt to raise an orc as human, was doomed from the start, and neither of us was ready for that admission, not yet. But the genetic awakening was irreversible. The orc I was always meant to be was emerging, displacing the human facade I'd worn for years. And soon, very soon, something would happen that would make pretending impossible. Something would trigger the violence that had been building inside me for years. And when it did, there would be no going back. No more counseling sessions or attempts at redemption or philosophical discussions about nature versus nurture. There would only be blood and screaming and the fundamental, terrible truth about what happens when you try to cage a predator and convince it that it's prey. The breaking point. It happened on a day that started like any other. I was assigned to construction work, helping to erect a new storage facility on the settlement's eastern edge. Simple labor, move materials, hold beams in place while human workers secured them. Tasks that required strength but no skill, perfectly designed for someone the settlement no longer trusted with anything complex. There were 5 humans on the crew, 4 laborers and 1 supervisor named Dietrich, a compact man with scarred hands and the perpetual scowl of someone who'd seen too much of the galaxy's ugliness to maintain any illusions about its nature. He'd never liked me, made no secret of his belief that keeping a Xenos in the settlement was foolish sentimentality that would eventually cost lives. But he was professional enough to work with me, to give clear instructions, to treat me like a piece of heavy equipment rather than something that deserved fear or hatred. The morning passed without incident. We hauled prefabricated wall sections into position, secured foundation points, did the mundane work of building shelter on a world that didn't want humans to survive. I performed my tasks mechanically, my mind elsewhere, thinking about the caves I'd found, about the genetic memories that were coming more frequently now, about the hunger for violence that never abated. The trouble started during the midday break. The human workers sat in the shade of an already erected wall, eating rations and talking about nothing important. I sat apart, as always, my size making it impractical to share their space. I was eating my own meal, some processed protein that tasted like paste but contained the calories my enormous body demanded, when I heard one of the laborers mention finding strange tracks in the northern Badlands. I looked up. What kind of tracks? The laborer, a young man named Petrov, glanced at me nervously. He always seemed nervous around me, which was fair enough considering what I was. Don't know for sure, but they were big, too big for any wildlife we've catalogued. Something in my chest tightened. How big? Bigger than human, but not as big as you. He said it reluctantly, as if afraid comparing anything to me would give offense. Could be an orc, Dietrich said, his tone flat. There were reports of feral greenskins in the region years ago. Most were hunted down, but a few might have survived. Orc. The word hit me like a physical blow. Somewhere out there, in the wilderness beyond the settlement, there might be others of my kind, not humans trying to civilize me, or understand me, or make me into something I wasn't. Actual orcs, living as orcs were meant to live, fighting and growing and existing without the burden of human expectations or values or judgments. We should investigate, I said, trying to keep my voice level, trying not to reveal how much this mattered. If there are orcs in the area, they could pose a threat to the settlement. Dietrich gave me a long look. You're a Xenos offering to hunt other Xenos. That strike anyone else as suspicious? I grew up here, I said. which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. This settlement is the only home I know. If there's a threat, I want to help deal with it. It was a good answer, dutiful, loyal. Exactly what a properly civilized Xenos should say, and it was also a complete lie. What I really wanted was to find those orcs, to see creatures like me, to perhaps join them, to escape the prison of human society, and finally exist as I was meant to. But I couldn't say that. So I played the role they wanted, the grateful pet defending its adopted home. Dietrich didn't look convinced, but he also didn't argue. We'll report it to the enforcers. They'll decide whether to send out a hunting party. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I moved materials, held beams, performed my assigned tasks while my mind raced with possibilities. Orcs, real orcs. The gestalt field that I'd been generating in isolation might finally have something to connect to. The violent urges that I'd been suppressing for years might finally find appropriate outlet. I could fight, really fight. And if I won, if I proved myself stronger than these feral greenskins, I would grow. I would become more. I would step into the destiny that had been denied to me for so long. The fantasies consumed me so thoroughly that I almost missed what happened next. We were positioning the last wall section of the day, a heavy piece that required my strength to maneuver into place. I was holding it vertical while the human workers secured the base when Petrov made a mistake. He attached his safety line to a bracket that wasn't fully secured. His weight on the line pulled the bracket free, and he fell, grabbing instinctively at the wall section to arrest his fall. The wall section, already unbalanced, tipped toward him. 3 tons of reinforced polymer and metal, falling at an angle that would crush him against the foundation. I saw it happening, my orc reflexes processing the situation faster than human minds could, and I reacted without thinking. I caught the wall section, simply reached up and stopped its fall, my muscles straining against the weight and momentum. For a moment I held it suspended, this enormous piece of construction material that should have required machinery to move, held in place by nothing but my strength. Then I carefully, slowly, lowered it back to vertical and set it down beside the foundation rather than on it. Petrov stared at me, his face white, understanding that I'd just saved his life. The other workers were frozen, shocked by the demonstration of raw power. Even Dietrich looked shaken, and he'd seen combat across multiple war zones. Because what I'd just done should have been impossible. The physics didn't work. A creature my size, however strong, shouldn't have been able to stop that much weight at that angle. But I wasn't operating on human physics. I was an orc, and orcs are bullshit strong, capable of feats that violate every principle of biomechanics and force distribution. We lift things we shouldn't be able to lift, survive impacts that should pulverize us, perform impossible acts of strength through sheer genetic gift and the subtle psychic field that all greenskins generate. I had just reminded everyone exactly what I was. "Thank you," Petrov whispered, his voice shaking. "You saved. I would have." I nodded, didn't say anything. Couldn't trust my voice not to reveal how good it had felt, how satisfying it was to finally use my full strength. To stop holding back, to demonstrate what I was actually capable of. This was what I was for. Power, strength, the ability to impose my will on physical reality through brute force. Not construction work or education or civilized cooperation. This. Dietrich ordered everyone to pack up early, to return to the settlement and report the incident. The wall section would have to be repositioned tomorrow, with proper machinery this time, with safety protocols that didn't rely on a Xenos preventing catastrophe. As we walked back, the human workers kept glancing at me nervously, as if seeing me for the first time, recognizing the danger they'd been working alongside. I should have felt bad about scaring them, should have regretted the demonstration of strength that had shattered the comfortable fiction of me being basically human, but bigger. But I didn't feel bad. I felt alive, powerful, real in a way I hadn't felt in years. For just a moment, I'd been what I was meant to be, and it was glorious. That night, I couldn't sleep. The restlessness that had been building for months reached a fever pitch. I paced my shelter, my muscles twitching with unreleased energy, my mind replaying the moment when I'd caught the wall section over and over. The satisfaction of it, the rightness of using my strength without restraint, the glimpse of what I could be if I stopped holding back, and underneath everything, the knowledge that there were orcs out there, somewhere in the wilderness, living free, fighting, growing, being what they were meant to be without apology or suppression. I needed to find them, needed to see them, needed to know if what I'd been missing, the hole in the center of my being, could be filled by connection with my own species. I left the settlement in the middle of the night, didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't ask permission. I simply walked past the perimeter sensors, my orc biology allowing me to move with a silence that belied my size, and headed north into the Badlands, toward where Petrov had seen the tracks, toward the possibility of finally belonging to something. The red sun rose as I walked, bathing the rocks in rust-colored light. I felt my skin soaking up the radiation, converting it to energy, preparing my body for whatever came next. My senses, sharper than human but not as acute as a full orc's would be, scanned the terrain for signs of passage. I found the tracks Petrov had mentioned. They were orc tracks, no question. Smaller than mine, but unmistakably green skin, clawed toes, heel strike pattern. The spacing of a gait designed for an upright biped much larger than human. I followed them, for hours, through canyons and over ridges, across boulder fields and dried stream beds. The tracks were old, several days at least, but they were fresh enough to follow. Whoever had made them was moving with purpose, not wandering randomly. They were heading somewhere specific, deeper into the wilderness, away from human habitation. And then I found the camp. It wasn't sophisticated. A few crude shelters made from rocks and scavenged materials, the remnants of fires, bones from kills scattered around the perimeter, but it was definitely orc habitation. The smell alone confirmed it. That peculiar funk of greenskin that no other species quite matches. Part fungal spores and part sweat and part something else entirely. The camp was abandoned now, but recently. The fires were cold but not ancient. The kills were fresh enough that scavengers hadn't completely stripped them. I searched the area, trying to find clues about how many orcs had been here, where they'd gone. And that's when I heard it. A sound that I'd only ever experienced in genetic memories. A sound that should have been impossible, that my human education said I would never hear, that represented everything I'd been denied. The war cry, the battle roar, the sound of orcs engaged in combat. It came from deeper in the Badlands, echoing off rocks, impossible to precisely locate, but unmistakably there. I ran toward it, my caution forgotten, my body responding to instincts I'd suppressed for years. This was it. This was what I'd been waiting for. Other orcs, fighting, and I could join them. I could finally fight like I was meant to fight. I could be what I was born to be. I ran until I saw them. 2 orcs, both smaller than me, but not by much, locked in brutal combat. They were beating each other with savage efficiency, fists and boots and teeth, fighting for dominance with the kind of pure aggression that made human violence look tame. Blood spattered the rocks. Both were wounded, gashed and bruised and clearly exhausted, but neither was backing down. This was a fight to finish. I watched, transfixed. This was what I needed, what I'd been craving for years. Real combat, serious violence, the fundamental expression of orc nature without restraint or apology. They were magnificent in their brutality, embodying everything I'd been taught to suppress. And I wanted it. Wanted to join them. Wanted to prove myself in combat, to earn my place through strength, to finally belong. One of the orcs noticed me. He disengaged from his opponent, turned to face me, his tusked face twisted in an expression I recognized from genetic memories. Challenge, threat, the instinctive response to an unknown orc entering territory. He roared, a wordless expression of dominance and warning, and my body responded without conscious thought. I roared back. The sound erupting from my throat felt right in a way that human words never had. Primal, honest, unfiltered. This was my language, the communication of strength and defiance and willingness to fight. The orc charged me, and every fiber of my being screamed yes. We collided like freight vehicles, the impact driving the breath from my lungs and cracking the stone beneath our feet. He was strong, toughened by years of combat and the orcoid growth mechanism working exactly as designed. But I was bigger. I'd been growing even without proper fights, my body preparing for violence that was always coming even if delayed. I was stronger. I caught his fist as it drove toward my face, twisted his arm, hearing tendons tear and bones crack. He didn't scream, didn't show pain, just headbutted me hard enough to split my skin and fill my vision with stars. I reeled but held on, using my size advantage to overpower him, to force him down. We crashed to the ground together, a tangle of limbs and fury and violence. It was glorious. Every punch I landed, every counter he threw, every moment of struggle and pain and effort felt like coming home. This was what I was for. This was what all that strength and aggression and genetic programming existed to express. Not construction work or carrying materials or gentle restraint. This, pure, honest, brutal combat. I won. Eventually. Inevitably. Size and strength overcame experience and desperation. I pinned him, my hands around his throat, squeezing until he stopped struggling. I could have killed him. Should have, probably, by orc standards. But something held me back. Some remnant of human teaching. Some vestige of civilized behavior that said you don't kill defeated opponents. I released him, stood up. The other orc, the one who'd been fighting him before I arrived, watched me warily. I looked back at him, still riding the high of combat, my blood singing with endorphins and satisfaction and the deep joy of finally fighting like I was meant to. And I realized that I couldn't stay, because if I stayed, if I joined these feral orcs and lived as greenskins were meant to live, I would become fully what my genetics demanded. I would lose whatever remained of my human education, my connection to the Brennans, my ability to exist anywhere except orc society. I would be making a choice, final and irreversible, to abandon humanity completely and embrace the monster I was born to be. And I wasn't ready for that choice. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because the human part of me, small and getting smaller but still present, still valued something about what the Brennans had given me. The knowledge, the self-awareness, the ability to choose rather than simply follow instinct. If I stayed here, I would lose that. I would become pure orc, magnificent and terrible and free from doubt or regret or choice. So I left. Walked away from the greatest satisfaction I'd ever known, back toward the settlement and restraint and the slow suffocation of suppressing my nature. The two orcs watched me go, probably confused by my behavior, by an orc who won a fight and then just left without claiming dominance or territory or anything. It wasn't normal greenskin behavior, but then nothing about me had ever been normal. I returned to the settlement as dawn broke, exhausted and bloodied, and changed in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The Brennans were waiting, had been up all night worrying when they discovered my absence. Margaret looked at the blood on my hands, the bruises forming on my green skin, the expression on my face, and she understood without asking. I'd found what I was looking for, and I'd chosen to come back anyway. She cried. I'd never seen her cry before. She held me, this tiny human woman embracing an orc twice her size, and she cried with what I eventually recognized as relief. Because she'd thought she'd lost me. Thought I would find other orcs and never return. Thought the experiment was over, that nature had won, that all her efforts had been for nothing. But I had come back. And that meant something. Meant that maybe, just maybe, the human part of me was stronger than she'd feared. That the education and values and civilization she'd tried to instill hadn't been completely overwhelmed by genetic programming. that there was still hope for me to be more than my biology demanded. She was wrong, of course. Coming back wasn't victory. It was cowardice, fear of fully committing to what I was, and that internal division, that inability to fully embrace either human or orc nature, would destroy me more thoroughly than choosing either path would have. But I didn't understand that yet. None of us did. We were all still pretending that I could exist in this liminal space, neither human nor fully orc, civilized monster forever balanced on the edge of violence. We were wrong, and the price for that wrongness would be paid in blood and screaming and the destruction of everything the Brennans had tried to build. But that reckoning was still ahead. For now, in the dawn light, with Margaret's arms around me and my hands still stained with the blood of the first real fight of my life, we could pretend. We could maintain the fiction that everything would be all right. That I could be saved, that love and education could triumph over nature. We could pretend, right up until the moment when pretending became impossible. When the dam finally, catastrophically broke. When the orc I'd always been erupted through the human facade and showed everyone what I really was. What I'd always been. What no amount of learning or compassion or desperate hope could ever change. The descent. After that night, something fundamental had shifted inside me. I'd tasted what I truly was. Had felt the satisfaction of fighting as an orc should fight, without restraint or moral consideration, pure expression of strength and violence. And now, trying to return to the gentle restraint of civilized existence felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit, like speaking a language that my mouth could form, but my soul didn't understand. The Brennans tried to pretend everything was normal. I went back to my assigned labor, moving materials and performing tasks that required only brute strength. But everyone could sense the change. The way I moved had shifted, become more predatory. The expressions on my face were harder to read, as if the human emotions I'd learned to simulate were fading, replaced by something more fundamental and less comprehensible to those who'd never known violence as necessity. Margaret continued our education sessions, but they felt hollow now. She would talk about philosophy and ethics, about the importance of controlling base impulses, about how all thinking beings could rise above their nature through will and wisdom. And I would nod and agree and say the things she wanted to hear. But we both knew it was performance. The student she'd taught, the one who genuinely engaged with these ideas and struggled to understand them, was gone, replaced by something that could simulate comprehension without experiencing it. The settlement's leadership was having urgent discussions about what to do with me. I heard fragments through Thomas, who attended the meetings and reported back what he could. There were calls to expel me, to send me into the wilderness before I caused real damage. Others advocated for more extreme measures, though they danced around actually saying execution in case Thomas reported the conversation. The argument for keeping me was getting weaker, based mainly on the Brennan's advocacy and the fact that I hadn't actually harmed anyone yet, but yet was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Everyone understood that it was only a matter of time. I demonstrated what I was capable of, both in physical power when I caught the falling wall section, and in behavioral terms when I disappeared to fight feral orcs. The fiction of me being a civilized being who happened to be Xenos was unsustainable. I was a predator being kept in a cage of social expectations, and predators eventually break free. The violence hunger was constant now, not just background craving, but active pain, a pressure building inside my skull that made concentration difficult and sleep impossible. My muscles ached for exertion, real exertion, the kind that came from combat rather than labor. My hands, designed for crushing and rending, felt useless when limited to gentle manipulation of objects designed for human grip. Everything felt wrong, felt constrained, felt like wearing chains that grew heavier every day. I started having blackout periods, not unconsciousness, but gaps in memory where I would come back to myself and discover hours had passed with no recollection of what I'd done. Thomas found me once, in my shelter, surrounded by crude weapons I'd apparently fashioned from scrap and stone. I had no memory of making them, but there they were. Clubs and blades and tools clearly designed for one purpose: killing. When he asked about them, I had no explanation to offer. I didn't remember building them, but some part of me, operating below conscious thought, clearly had. The genetic memories were intensifying, becoming more vivid and intrusive. I would be doing something mundane, carrying materials or eating a meal, and suddenly I'd be elsewhere, on a battlefield, surrounded by violence and screaming and the glorious chaos of full orcoid war. These weren't just images anymore. They came with sensation, with smell and sound and the kinesthetic memory of fighting. I could feel muscles I'd never used executing techniques I'd never learned, could hear war cries in a language I spoke but hadn't consciously studied, could taste the particular satisfaction of victory achieved through overwhelming force. Margaret noticed the deterioration. She suggested gently that I might benefit from speaking to the settlement's medici, that perhaps there were treatments or therapies that could help with what she called invasive thoughts and dissociative episodes. She was trying to medicalize what was happening to me, to frame it as illness rather than nature asserting itself. I appreciated the attempt, even knowing it was futile. You can't medicate away genetic programming. You can't therapy your way out of being what you fundamentally are. But I went to the medici anyway, partly to placate Margaret, and partly because I was becoming frightened of myself. The blackouts, the weapons appearing without memory of making them, the increasing difficulty separating genetic memories from actual experience. I was losing coherence, fragments of orc nature erupting through the human structure like magma through weakening crust. The medici, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Keene, who'd seen enough frontier hardship to maintain professional detachment in most circumstances, tried to approach my condition clinically. She ran tests, examined my brain patterns, analyzed hormone levels and neurochemistry, and found nothing wrong in any conventional sense. My orc physiology was functioning exactly as designed. All the changes I was experiencing, the violent urges and genetic memories, and deteriorating impulse control, were developmentally appropriate for a maturing greenskin. In other words, I wasn't sick. I was becoming what I was supposed to be. The problem wasn't medical. It was existential. I was an orc trying to exist as if I were human, and the stress of that fundamental contradiction was fracturing my psyche. Dr. Keene couldn't say that directly. Professional courtesy and the Brennan's feelings required more diplomatic phrasing. But that was the substance of her diagnosis. I was an incompatible element in a human system, and integration was failing. She prescribed sedatives, though she admitted they would likely have limited effect on orc metabolism. She recommended increased physical activity to exhaust my body, though we both knew that labor wasn't the same as combat. She suggested continued counseling with Margaret and the settlement's confessor, though after years of such counseling producing no meaningful change, the suggestion felt perfunctory. Mainly, she looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear, and the certain knowledge that this situation would end badly. I appreciated her honesty, at least. She didn't pretend there was a solution, didn't offer false hope that the right combination of therapy and medication would fix me. She understood what I was and what that meant. And she understood that the settlement was keeping a ticking explosive in its midst, waiting for the pressure to exceed the containment. The waiting was the worst part. Knowing that something terrible was coming, that I was going to do something unforgivable, that all the restraint and civilization and human values were temporary barriers against inevitable disaster. I started avoiding people, staying in my shelter or the wilderness, minimizing contact because every interaction felt dangerous. Every human I encountered was smaller than me, weaker, vulnerable, and my orc instincts screamed at me to assert dominance, to prove my strength, to do what I was built for. Thomas tried to reach me during this period. He'd come to my shelter, sit outside at a careful distance, and talk. About his day, about the settlement's challenges, about nothing important. Just maintaining connection, reminding me that I wasn't completely alone. I appreciated it more than I could express. Not because the conversations helped. They didn't, not really. But because he was trying, still believing, against all evidence and reason, that I could be saved. He asked me once, during one of these visits, if I wished he'd never found me. If I thought I would have been happier growing up feral, fighting and killing and living pure orc existence without the burden of human consciousness. It was a good question, profound even, and I didn't have a good answer. Would ignorance have been better? Living as pure instinct, fighting and growing and eventually dying in some glorious battle, never knowing anything else was possible? Or was it better to have this awareness, this understanding of what I could have been, even if that knowledge made everything harder? I still don't know. Both options were terrible in their own ways, but at least feral orcs didn't have to experience the particular agony of knowing exactly what they were giving up. The settlement's children had started having nightmares about me. I learned this from Margaret, who'd been approached by several parents whose children reported dreams of the green monster coming for them. She told me this gently, carefully, as if the news might wound me. And maybe it should have. Maybe the human part of me should have been devastated to learn that children feared me, that I'd become the monster in their darkest imaginings. But mostly, I felt nothing. Or worse, a kind of dark satisfaction. Let them fear me. Fear was appropriate. I was dangerous. They should be afraid. The fact that they'd managed to convince themselves otherwise for years, that they'd walked past me daily and pretended I was basically harmless, said more about human capacity for self-deception than anything else. The children, with their unfiltered instincts and brutal honesty, understood the truth that adults had papered over with social courtesy and wishful thinking. Margaret tried to reassure the parents, to insist that I'd never harmed anyone, that the children's fears were unfounded. But I could see she didn't quite believe it herself anymore. She was afraid too, not of immediate violence perhaps, but of what I represented, of the failure of her great experiment, of the possibility that you really couldn't civilize the uncivilizable, that some natures were too fundamental to overcome through education and love. I was proving everything the Imperium believed about Xenos, that we were incompatible with human society, that tolerance and integration were impossible, that the only solution to the alien problem was isolation or extermination, never cooperation or coexistence. The Brennans had tried to prove otherwise, had staked their reputations and safety on the belief that species didn't determine destiny, and I was demonstrating, day by day, that they were wrong. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been given every advantage, every opportunity to become more than my genetics, education, safety, acceptance from at least some humans, and I was failing anyway. Not because the Brennans hadn't tried hard enough or done something wrong, but because you can't teach a storm to be gentle or convince the ocean to be still. I was what I was, an orc, a weapon given consciousness but still fundamentally a weapon, and weapons, sooner or later, get used for what they're designed for, no matter how much anyone wishes otherwise. The end, when it came, wasn't dramatic. There was no single triggering event, no moment of decision where I chose violence over restraint. It was more gradual than that. An erosion of will, a slow surrender to the inevitable. The dam developing cracks, then fractures, then finally giving way entirely. I was in my shelter, late at night, trying to sleep and failing as usual. The genetic memories were particularly vivid, battering at my consciousness like waves against a cliff. Battles, victories, the satisfaction of proving strength through violence, the Gestalt field connecting me to other orcs in moments of shared aggression. Everything I'd been denied, everything I needed, playing out in my mind with cruel clarity, and I realized that I couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't spend another day pretending, restraining, suppressing what I was. Couldn't maintain the fiction that I was anything but what my genetics demanded. The human part of me, the educated, civilized part that valued the Brennans and appreciated what they'd tried to do, was getting smaller, dimmer, less relevant to decisions about how to exist. And the orc part, impatient and inexorable as plate tectonics, was rising to dominance. I stood up, walked to the makeshift weapons I'd crafted during blackouts, picked up the largest club, a crude but effective thing made from industrial scrap and wrapped with wire for grip. It felt right in my hands, natural, like finding a missing limb I'd only now realized I'd been without. I left my shelter, headed toward the settlement proper. Moving with purpose now, the internal conflict that had paralyzed me for years suddenly resolved. I wasn't going to fight it anymore. Wasn't going to cage the violence or suppress the nature or pretend I could be something other than orc. I was done. And whatever happened next, at least I would be honest. At least I would be myself, completely and without apology, for however long I lasted. The night air was cool against my skin. Above, stars I couldn't name sparkled in patterns that meant nothing to me. The settlement lights glowed ahead, human civilization maintaining its fragile purchase on a world that didn't want it. And I walked toward those lights, weapon in hand, ready to become the monster they'd always feared I would be. This was it. The moment when pretending became impossible. When the orc inside me, patient and inevitable, finally claimed dominance. When all the education and values and desperate hope of the Brennans met the fundamental truth of what I was and lost. I was sorry, in some distant way that barely registered through the rising tide of violence, hunger. Sorry for Thomas and Margaret who tried so hard. Sorry for the settlement that had tolerated my presence far longer than wisdom suggested. Sorry that I couldn't be what they needed me to be. But sorry wasn't enough to stop what was coming. Nothing was enough, because I was an orc, and orcs exist to fight, and I'd been starved of that existence for far too long. The breaking point had finally, inevitably, catastrophically arrived, and everyone was about to learn what happens when you try to civilize a creature designed by ancient gods to be an engine of war, blood and screaming, and the end of all illusions. That's what was coming, and I walked toward it with steady steps, my weapon ready, my nature finally, terribly unleashed. Aftermath and truth. I need to tell you something important. I've been lying to you, or at least misleading you throughout this entire narrative. Not about the facts, those are accurate, but about where I am now, who I am now, and what actually happened that night when I walked toward the settlement with violence in my heart and a weapon in my hands. I didn't attack the settlement. I stopped myself, literally feet from the first building, my weapon raised and every muscle tensed for violence. I stopped because I saw a child through a window, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, sleeping peacefully with a stuffed animal clutched to her chest. And something in me, the human part that I thought had been completely overwhelmed, reasserted itself with crystalline clarity. I couldn't do it. Couldn't bring violence to people who tolerated me, who tried to help me, who didn't deserve to be murdered by the Xenos they'd shown kindness. I couldn't be the monster that would have validated every human prejudice about aliens, that would have proven the Imperium right about the impossibility of coexistence. I couldn't betray the Brennans like that, couldn't destroy years of their work and hope and love through one night of violence. So I dropped the weapon, turned around, walked away from the settlement and into the wilderness, kept walking until dawn, until I was so far from human habitation that I could scream my frustration at the empty sky without frightening anyone. And then I made a decision. I would leave, not to find feral orcs and join them. That path led to becoming something that couldn't return, couldn't maintain any connection to the human concepts I'd been taught. But I would leave the settlement, remove myself as a threat and a burden, find somewhere I could exist without constant danger to others. I spent weeks in the wilderness, surviving on photosynthesis and hunted meat, thinking about what I wanted to be. Not what my genetics demanded or what humans expected, but what I actually wanted. And I realized something profound. The conflict inside me wasn't between orc and human nature. It was between determinism and choice. My orc genetics gave me inclinations, urges, instinctive knowledge. They made certain paths easier and others harder, but they didn't eliminate choice entirely. I could choose to fight or not fight. to grow or stay smaller, to embrace violence or find other outlets. The choosing was harder for me than for humans, required more effort and discipline, cost more in terms of psychological stress. But it was possible. I wasn't a slave to my nature. I was in dialogue with it. I returned to the settlement after a month. The Brennans had been devastated by my disappearance, fearing the worst. The settlement's leadership had assumed I'd gone feral, joined my kind, become the threat they'd always known I could be. When I walked back into their midst, unarmed and careful, explaining what had happened and what I wanted to do, the reactions ranged from skepticism to cautious relief. I proposed a compromise. I would stay in the wilderness, in the caves I'd found, living mostly apart from human society, but I would help the settlement when needed, using my strength for tasks too dangerous or difficult for humans. In exchange, they would provide certain supplies I couldn't produce myself, maintain communication, allow me to remain connected to human civilization without requiring daily integration. It wasn't a perfect solution. I still struggled with violence urges, still experienced genetic memories and orcoid instincts that made peaceful existence difficult. But I'd found a way to manage it. Physical exertion that pushed my body to its limits, even without combat. Meditation techniques that Margaret taught me, adapted for a consciousness that worked differently than human minds. Projects in the caves, building and creating things that gave my mech boy inclinations outlet, without threatening anyone. And most importantly, I maintained connection with the Brennans. They visited regularly, bringing supplies and conversation, and the reminder that I wasn't completely alone, that I had chosen, against all my genetic programming, to remain part of their world. Not fully integrated, never that, but connected, valued, more than my biology demanded I be. Years passed. The settlement grew, prospered, had the usual frontier struggles and triumphs. I remained in my caves, the hermit Xenos who helped sometimes and stayed away otherwise. New generations of colonists grew up knowing me as a fixture, the strange green giant who lived in the Badlands and occasionally saved lives through intervention that seemed miraculous, but was just orc strength applied carefully. The violence urges never completely disappeared. On bad days, the need to fight was overwhelming, and I would pound rocks to dust or tear dead trees apart with my bare hands, channeling the aggression into destruction of inanimate objects. On good days, I could almost convince myself that I'd achieved some kind of peace, some balance between competing natures, and I continued growing, slowly, without combat to accelerate the process, but growing nonetheless. I'm massive now, easily 10 feet tall, my frame thick with muscle that's never been fully tested. The genetic programming continues its work, preparing me for violence I refuse to engage in, building a weapon that I've chosen not to use. Sometimes I wonder if I'm wasting my potential. If all this strength and capability, lying dormant in the wilderness, represents a terrible waste of resources. I could be leading orc crusades, growing to war boss size, experiencing the fulfillment my genetics promise if I just surrendered to instinct. Instead, I choose restraint, choose isolation, choose the harder path because it's the right one according to values I was taught but that aren't natural to my species. Am I better for it? I honestly don't know. The human part of me, the one that learned morality and philosophy from Margaret, says yes, absolutely. The choice to restrain power is what defines civilization, what separates thinking beings from animals acting on instinct. But the orc part, which grows stronger every year despite my best efforts at suppression, whispers that I'm denying my nature, crippling myself, living half a life out of fear and misplaced loyalty to a species that isn't my own. Both voices are right, both voices are wrong. The truth is more complicated than either pure nature or pure nurture. I'm an orc who was raised by humans, and that combination creates something that doesn't fit neatly into either category. I'm not human, no matter how much education I received. But I'm not a normal orc either. My development shaped by experiences no other greenskin has had. I exist in the space between. Not comfortable, never that. But possible, sustainable. A proof, perhaps, that species doesn't determine destiny entirely, that even a creature engineered for violence can choose something else, if given the tools and support and stubborn refusal to accept easy answers. The Imperium would say, I'm an aberration, a statistical outlier that proves nothing about the general impossibility of human-Xenos coexistence. They're probably right. My existence required specific circumstances that are unlikely to be replicated. A surveyor who made an improbable choice, a settlement isolated enough to hide me, educators willing to invest years in an experiment that should have failed, and my own peculiar combination of orc strength with enough self-control to avoid disaster. You can't build policy around outliers, can't create integration programs assuming every orc could be raised like I was. The vast majority would fail, would revert to violence, would prove that the Imperium's harsh Xenos policies are pragmatically necessary, however morally uncomfortable. I understand this. I don't like it, but I understand it. What I hope to offer, what I've tried to show through this testimony, is that the categories we use to divide the galaxy into human and alien, civilized and savage, redeemable and irredeemable, these categories are real but not absolute. There are spaces in between, exceptions that complicate the rules, possibilities that we miss when we insist on binary thinking. I am an orc. I will always be an orc. My biology ensures that. My genetic programming guarantees it. But I'm also Marcus, the student that Margaret taught, the project that Thomas saved, the being that chose restraint over instinct, however difficult that choice remains. Both things are true. The tension between them defines my existence. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that orcs can be civilized, or that nature doesn't matter, or that enough education can overcome any genetic programming. But that choice exists even for beings designed to be weapons. That the margin of that choice might be narrow, the effort required enormous, the success rate depressingly low. But the possibility remains, however slim, however difficult to achieve. The Brennans are old now. Thomas's hands shake when he climbs the path to my caves. Margaret's eyes have lost some of their sharpness, her step less certain than it once was. They won't be visiting much longer, a truth we all acknowledge without discussing. When they're gone, I'll lose my closest connection to humanity, my strongest anchor to the life they tried to build for me. I don't know what happens after that. Maybe I'll drift further into orc nature, the human influences fading without reinforcement. Maybe I'll finally leave the planet, seek out green-skinned society, become what I was always meant to be. Maybe I'll stay in these caves, an increasingly isolated being, neither human nor fully orc, aging and growing and eventually dying without ever truly belonging anywhere. The uncertainty doesn't frighten me anymore. I've made peace with existing in the space between, with being the question rather than the answer. My life is a testimony to possibility, however limited, however unusual. I am proof that even the most unlikely transformations can occur under the right circumstances. Not easily, not reliably, not in ways that can be replicated or scaled or turned into policy, but possible. Against all odds, against genetic programming and imperial doctrine, and the fundamental incompatibility of species designed by different creators for different purposes, possible. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being one impossible thing, one statistical outlier, one exception to all the rules, is its own kind of victory. Not the glorious triumph that orc genetics promise me if I surrender to violence, but a quieter victory, harder one, defined by the choices I make every single day to be something my biology says I shouldn't be. I'm an orc raised by humans, and I'm still here, still choosing restraint, still maintaining the connection to civilization, even though it costs me everything my instincts say I should value. I don't know if that makes me better or worse than my feral kin who live pure orc existence without the burden of human consciousness. But it makes me different, and in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the machinery of empires grinding across a million worlds. Being different might be the only rebellion available to creatures like me. Small rebellion, perhaps, ultimately futile in the grand scheme of galactic violence, but mine, chosen, real. And that, I've come to believe, is the best any of us can hope for. To choose, however limited our options, to maintain our dignity, however small and strange and impossible our existence, to be more than what we were designed to be, even if only by the narrowest of margins. I am Marcus. I am an orc. I am both and neither, and something new that has no proper name. And I survive, one day at a time, through the choices that should be impossible but somehow aren't. That's my story. That's my truth. That's what it means to be an orc raised by humans in Warhammer 40,000. It's not the story anyone expected, not the tragedy of inevitable violence that the settlement feared, not the triumphant redemption that the Brennans hoped for, not the clear moral lesson that would make sense of the strange circumstances of my existence. It's messier than that, more complicated, more human, ironically, in its refusal to fit neat narratives or confirm easy assumptions. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the only honest testimony is the one that resists simplification, that insists on being complex and contradictory and difficult. I am an orc raised by humans, and I'm still writing this story, one choice at a time, for however long I last in this strange space between species and destinies. If you found this deep dive into the strange, impossible existence of an orc raised by humans fascinating, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to Stories of Hammer. We explore the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, bringing you narratives and perspectives that challenge what you thought you knew about this grim, dark setting. Your support helps us continue creating these long-form, immersive stories that go deeper than surface-level lore. Thank you for listening, and may the Emperor, or Gork and Mork, or whatever powers watch over beings like me, grant you fortune in the darkness.